It's September 1940, the height of the Blitz. German bombs are falling on London every night. Buildings are collapsing, fires are raging, thousands are dying. And in the midst of this apocalyptic destruction, there's a pub. Maybe it's missing half its roof, maybe the windows are blown out, maybe there's rubble in the street outside, but the doors are open, the beer is flowing, and the regulars are inside having a pint. This wasn't unusual. This was policy. While the British government was organizing evacuations, building shelters, and coordinating civil defense, they were also doing something that might seem trivial but was actually considered essential. They were making absolutely certain the pub stayed open. We know about Britain's finest hour, about Churchill's speeches and the RAF pilots and the stoic resilience of ordinary people. But there's a stranger, more revealing story underneath. The story of how the British government waged a deliberate, sophisticated psychological campaign to maintain civilian morale, and how the humble pub became a crucial weapon in that war. Today we're exploring Britain's secret war on morale, how pubs, tea, BBC broadcasts, deliberately curated propaganda, and even strategic lies were weaponized to keep the nation functioning when logic said it should collapse. This is the story of how Britain survived not just through military resistance, but through a calculated effort to shape how people felt, what they believed, and how they coped with unimaginable stress. When war broke out in September 1939, Britain established the Ministry of Information officially to manage propaganda and government communications. But its real job was much more interesting: psychological warfare directed at Britain's own population. This wasn't cynical manipulation exactly, or not only that. The ministry understood something crucial: Britain couldn't win a long war if civilian morale collapsed. You could have the best military in the world, but if workers stopped showing up to factories, if people panicked and fled cities, if the population lost the will to continue, you'd lose. So the Ministry of Information became, essentially, Britain's Ministry of Morale. Its job was to monitor how people were feeling, identify threats to morale, and take action, sometimes subtle, sometimes direct, to keep the nation's collective psychology stable. The ministry employed researchers, psychologists, anthropologists, and sociologists. They conducted surveys, analyzed reports from regional observers, and tracked rumors. They created a sophisticated intelligence operation aimed not at enemy territory but at British streets, factories, and homes. This was pioneering work in what we'd now call psychological operations or information warfare. And it was wildly successful. One of the most fascinating programs was called Mass Observation, started in 1937 but expanded dramatically during the war. This was a social research organization that recruited hundreds of volunteer observers, ordinary people who would write detailed diaries about daily life and report on conversations, attitudes, and morale in their communities. These observers would go to pubs, ride buses, stand in queues, and eavesdrop on conversations. They'd note what people were saying about the war, what rumors were circulating, what complaints were common, what jokes people were telling. The reports went to the Ministry of Information and provided real-time intelligence about civilian morale. If people in Manchester were particularly anxious about something, the government would know within days. If a rumor was spreading in East London, officials could track it and decide whether to counter it or ignore it. This sounds Orwellian, and George Orwell, who worked at the BBC during the war, was certainly influenced by programs like this when writing 1984. But mass observation was actually voluntary and surprisingly benign. People knew they were being observed, unlike in a totalitarian state, and the goal wasn't to punish dissent but to understand and address genuine concerns. The intelligence gathered revealed some surprising truths about British morale that challenged official assumptions. First, people were more resilient than expected. The government had anticipated mass panic when bombing started. They'd prepared for breakdowns in civil order, widespread looting, and psychological collapse. Instead, most people adapted remarkably well. Second, morale was fragile in unexpected ways. Grand speeches about sacrifice didn't help much. What mattered was practical stuff. Could you get tea? Were the buses running? Could you find your neighbors after a raid? Was the pub open? Third, information mattered more than inspiration. People could handle bad news if they felt they were being told the truth. What destroyed morale was feeling lied to, feeling like the government was hiding things, feeling disconnected from reality. Fourth, and this is crucial, maintaining normal routines was psychologically essential. When everything else was chaos, small acts of normalcy became lifelines. Having a pint at your local. Listening to your favorite BBC program. Getting the morning newspaper. These mundane things held society together. Based on this intelligence, the government developed a sophisticated morale strategy with several key elements: keep essential services running no matter what, transport, communication, shops, pubs, provide accurate information, mostly, but frame it optimistically, create rituals and routines that gave structure to chaos, emphasize community and collective effort, use humor to diffuse fear and build resilience, make sure people had small pleasures to look forward to, and crucially, don't tell people how to feel. Don't lecture them about courage or duty. Instead, create conditions where maintaining morale feels natural, even inevitable. The pub strategy fit perfectly into this framework. To understand why the British government cared so much about keeping pubs open, you need to understand what pubs meant in 1940s Britain. Pubs weren't just places to drink, they were the social infrastructure of working-class life. They were where you saw neighbors, heard news, found out who'd survived the night's bombing, got help if you needed it, and maintained connection to your community. In an era before television, before widespread telephone ownership, before social media, the pub was where information flowed. Not just official news, gossip, rumors, practical information about where to find scarce goods, which streets were blocked, which shelters were safest. The pub was also a pressure valve. After a night in a shelter listening to bombs fall, after a day's shift in a factory making munitions, after digging through rubble looking for survivors, people needed somewhere to decompress, to process trauma, to feel human again. The pub provided that, and critically, pubs were democratic spaces. Rich and poor, men and women, increasingly as the war went on, different professions and backgrounds, they mixed in pubs in ways they didn't elsewhere. This created a sense of shared experience, of being in it together, that was essential for morale. When bombing began in earnest in September 1940, the government made an explicit decision: pubs would stay open unless physically destroyed. This wasn't automatic. There were arguments for closing them: conserve resources, reduce fire hazards, free up workers for other duties. Some officials argued that drinking was a waste of vital supplies and that people should be more austere, but the Ministry of Information's research was clear: closing pubs would devastate morale. The psychological benefit of having somewhere to go, something normal to do, outweighed any practical savings, so pubs stayed open. Even when half destroyed. Even when supplies were limited. Even when it seemed almost absurd to be serving beer while the world was ending outside, pub landlords were given guidance on how to operate during raids: keep blackout curtains secure, have a plan for if the building was hit, know where your nearest shelter was. But the message was clear: keep serving. Keeping pubs open required keeping them supplied with beer, which became a logistical and political challenge. Beer production required resources: barley, hops, fuel, labor, transportation. All of these were desperately needed elsewhere. There was genuine debate about whether Britain could afford to keep brewing beer during total war. The decision to maintain beer production, albeit at reduced alcohol content and with substituted ingredients, was explicitly justified on morale grounds. Officials argued that beer wasn't a luxury but a necessity for keeping workers productive and civilians stable. This created interesting tensions. The government would lecture people about waste and sacrifice, about tightening belts and doing without. But simultaneously, they were ensuring beer kept flowing to pubs. The implicit message: your psychological well-being matters, even if we can't always say that explicitly. Beer supply became a carefully managed resource. Breweries were given quotas and allocations. Pubs were instructed on how to make supplies last. The beer got weaker, people joked about it being like dishwater, but it kept coming. The government quietly used pubs as information distribution points. Posters about civil defense, about rationing, about security, about war bonds, these appeared in pubs because that's where people were. Local ARP, air raid precautions, wardens would stop at pubs to spread information and gather intelligence about local conditions. Police would use pubs as informal command posts during raids. Community leaders would organize responses to emergencies with meetings at the local pub. The pub became a node in the informal communication network that kept communities functioning when formal infrastructure was damaged or overwhelmed. But the real function of pubs was psychological, and it was subtle. By staying open, pubs sent a message: we're still here, life continues, the Germans haven't won. It was a small act of defiance. Hitler can drop bombs, but he can't stop us having a pint. This mattered more than it might seem. When everything else was disrupted, your house might be damaged, your workplace might be destroyed, your street might be rubble, the pub being open was a touchstone of continuity. Some things hadn't changed. Some things couldn't be destroyed. The ritual of going to the pub, ordering your usual, seeing familiar faces, exchanging the same greetings, these repetitive acts were psychologically stabilizing. They created islands of normalcy in a sea of chaos. And the social connection mattered immensely. Isolation destroys morale. Community sustains it. The pub forced people to be together, to talk, to share experiences, to not be alone with their fear. If pubs were the working-class morale infrastructure, tea was universal. The British government treated tea supply as a strategic priority second only to actual military supplies. This seems absurd until you understand how central tea was to British daily life and psychological equilibrium. The morning cup of tea, the tea break at work, tea after an air raid, tea when you got bad news, tea was the ritual response to everything. The government ensured tea imports continued even when shipping was desperately scarce and German U-boats were sinking merchant ships constantly. They rationed tea but made sure everyone got some. They promoted tea breaks in factories as essential for productivity. Why? Same reason as pubs, tea breaks were pressure valves, moments of normalcy, small pleasures that kept people functioning. The simple act of boiling water and making tea was comforting, familiar, controllable in a world where nothing else was. The BBC became another crucial morale tool. Radio was how most people got news, and the government understood that controlling the tone and content of broadcasts was essential. The BBC balanced serious war coverage with entertainment, comedy shows, music programs, serials that people followed religiously. ITMA, It's That Man Again, was a comedy show that became a national phenomenon. People would quote lines to each other, creating shared cultural references that built community. But the BBC also maintained strict routines. News at the same time every day. Regular programming schedules. Even when broadcasting from makeshift studios, even when announcers had to shelter during raids, the BBC maintained its schedule. This regularity was reassuring. Whatever else was chaos, the BBC was reliable. You could plan your day around it. In small ways, this helped people feel some control over their lives. The government's approach to information was sophisticated. They mostly told the truth, but framed it carefully. When things went badly, they'd acknowledge it but emphasize what was being done and what people could do. When things went well, they'd celebrate but remind people the war wasn't over. The goal was realism without despair, optimism without complacency, but there were strategic lies. The myth that eating carrots improved RAF pilots' night vision? That was propaganda to hide the fact that Britain had developed radar. The story was useful. It encouraged people to eat vegetables at a time when food was scarce, but it was also misdirection. Similarly, some German bombing casualties and damage were underreported early on. Not to hide the truth indefinitely but to prevent panic before civil defense was fully organized. The calculation was, what lies serve morale better than the truth would? And interestingly, the government was usually cautious about lying because their research showed people were good at detecting dishonesty and that being caught lying destroyed trust and morale. The government actively promoted community organizations and activities, not just civil defense but also social activities. British restaurants were communal kitchens where people could get affordable hot meals. They weren't just about feeding people, they were about bringing people together, creating community around shared meals, dances, concerts, film screenings. These continued throughout the war, often in damaged buildings or improvised venues. The government supported them, understanding that people needed joy, needed social connection, needed to feel alive and not just surviving. There were Wings for Victory weeks, fundraising campaigns for war bonds that were part finance and part community celebration. These gave people something to participate in, made them feel involved in the war effort beyond passive suffering. Interestingly, the famous Keep Calm and Carry On poster was never actually used during the war. It was designed in 1939 but was held in reserve for a crisis that, in the government's view, never quite arrived. The real slogan that was used everywhere was Keep Calm and Carry On's precursor: your courage, your cheerfulness, your resolution will bring us victory. But the fact that Keep Calm and Carry On has become iconic tells us something about how we remember the war. We've romanticized British stoicism. The reality was more complex. People weren't just keeping calm. They were being actively supported, their morale was being carefully managed, and the government was working hard to create conditions where carrying on felt possible. Churchill called the home front the second front, meaning it was as important as military operations. This wasn't just rhetoric. The government understood that if civilian morale collapsed, if production stopped, if people panicked or gave up, Britain would lose regardless of military success. So maintaining morale was literally a strategic priority. Resources were allocated to morale maintenance that could have gone elsewhere. Beer production continued. Entertainment was supported. BBC programming maintained variety. These weren't luxuries or wastes, they were investments in maintaining a functioning society under extreme stress. The evidence suggests that these measures were successful. British civilian morale during the Blitz was higher than anyone expected and higher than German morale under comparable bombing later in the war. There were certainly moments of fear, exhaustion, and despair. There was some looting. There were people who broke down. But mass panic never happened. Production continued. Civil defense functioned. People kept showing up to work, kept following rules, kept functioning as a society. Mass observation reports from late 1940 and early 1941 show surprising resilience. People complained about specific things: poor shelter conditions, inadequate information, bureaucratic failures, but overall morale remained stable or even improved after the initial shock of bombing. Why did it work? Several factors. First, the government strategy was based on research rather than assumptions. They listened to what people actually needed rather than lecturing them about what they should need. Second, the approach was holistic. It wasn't just propaganda but practical support. People could tolerate bombing better when basic services continued, when they could get tea and beer, when they had places to go. Third, the emphasis on community and shared experience was powerful. People felt they weren't alone in their suffering, which made it more bearable. Fourth, maintaining normalcy gave people a sense of control. You couldn't control when bombs fell, but you could control going to the pub, having tea, listening to the BBC. It's important to note that morale strategies weren't equally effective across all classes. Working-class communities in heavily bombed areas like East London bore the brunt of suffering. The pub and tea strategy worked well for working-class morale. But upper-class morale was maintained differently, through the country house system, private clubs, access to resources that ordinary people lacked. There was real tension about this inequality. When the wealthy could evacuate while workers had to stay, when officers had better conditions than enlisted men, when rationing affected different classes unequally, this damaged morale and created resentment. The government tried to manage this with propaganda emphasizing shared sacrifice: we're all in this together. But the reality was more complicated. The morale campaign was most effective for people who felt they were being treated fairly, and fairness was often more perception than reality. The morale maintenance strategies of World War II influenced post-war Britain profoundly. The expectation of government responsibility for citizens' well-being, not just survival but quality of life, contributed to the creation of the welfare state. If the government could ensure beer and tea during total war, people reasoned, surely it could ensure healthcare and housing during peace. The community spirit fostered during the war influenced social policy for decades. The idea that society was collectively responsible for all its members, that no one should be left behind, this wasn't just wartime propaganda but became a genuine social value. The BBC's role as a trusted national institution was cemented during the war. The relationship between citizens and public broadcasting established then still influences British media culture today. The British Morale Campaign offers lessons relevant to modern crises, pandemics, climate change, economic disruptions. First, practical support matters more than inspirational rhetoric. People need functioning services, accurate information, and small pleasures, not just speeches about courage. Second, maintaining routines and normalcy is psychologically crucial during extended crises. People need structure, predictability, and familiar comforts to stay stable. Third, community connections are protective. Isolation destroys resilience. Being together, even in small ways, builds it. Fourth, government credibility requires honesty. You can frame information optimistically, but if people catch you lying, trust collapses and morale suffers. Fifth, seemingly trivial things, pubs, tea, entertainment, aren't trivial during crises. They're essential infrastructure for psychological well-being. We should also acknowledge the darker aspects of Britain's morale campaign. It was, ultimately, manipulation. The government was deliberately shaping how people thought and felt. Even if the goal was beneficial, the methods raise ethical questions about consent and autonomy. Some propaganda was dishonest. Some information was withheld. Some dissent was suppressed, though much less than in authoritarian countries. The line between supporting morale and controlling thought was sometimes blurred. The mass observation program, however benign its intentions, was surveillance. People were being watched and reported on. That this was used for generally good purposes doesn't eliminate the ethical concerns, and the emphasis on keeping calm and carrying on had costs. Some people's trauma was minimized. Some legitimate complaints were dismissed as bad for morale. The cultural expectation of stoicism made it harder for people who were struggling to seek help. The story of Britain's pubs during World War II is really a story about how societies survive extreme stress. It wasn't just military strength or industrial capacity that let Britain endure the Blitz and continue fighting. It was a sophisticated, deliberate psychological campaign to maintain civilian morale through practical support, careful information management, and preservation of small pleasures and routines. The pub was a symbol and tool of this campaign, a gathering place that provided community, normalcy, and small acts of defiance against chaos. Keeping pubs open when bombs were falling was logistically challenging and used scarce resources, but it was strategically essential. This tells us something important about human resilience. We're not resilient just through willpower or courage. We're resilient when we have community, when we have routines, when we have small pleasures to look forward to, when we feel connected to something larger than ourselves. The British government understood this intuitively and acted on it systematically. They created conditions where maintaining morale felt natural, where carrying on was the path of least resistance, where community and continuity were built into daily life. Was this manipulation? Yes, in a sense. But it was also support, infrastructure, and genuine concern for citizens' well-being. The line between helping people cope and controlling how they think is blurry. And wartime Britain existed in that ambiguous space. The legacy of this campaign shaped post-war Britain, the welfare state, the BBC's role, expectations about government responsibility. The idea that government should care about citizens' quality of life, not just their survival, was reinforced by a war where morale maintenance was strategic priority. And in our own era of extended crises, pandemics, Climate change, political instability, there are lessons here. People need more than information and exhortations. They need practical support, maintained routines, small pleasures, and community connections. They need their equivalent of the pub that stays open when the world is falling apart, because in the end, resilience isn't just individual. It's social, collective, built through institutions and rituals and shared experiences. Britain survived the Blitz not just because individuals were brave, but because society, with deliberate government effort, created conditions where bravery felt possible, where carrying on felt natural, where a pint at your local could be an act of defiance and a source of strength. The pubs that never closed weren't just serving beer. They were serving hope, community, normalcy, and resilience. And that might be the most important thing any institution can provide during a crisis.